All right. So good morning. My name is Alex. I'm one of the two Adobe specialists at the University of Arizona. Brian is here with us, our lead Adobe specialist. And we also have Tess, who's our program coordinator and also a freelance photographer. So we'll be jumping back and forth, showing you all about Lightroom and Photoshop together. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. This workshop is called Photography Workflow with Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. And the point of this session is to get you familiarized with using Lightroom to organize, catalog, adjust your images, and jumping into Photoshop to make a little more precise, perhaps more complex editing, and then going back into Lightroom to send your pictures out. Lightroom Classic, which I just call Lightroom out of habit, is the application we'll be using. A few years ago, Adobe decided to create an additional Lightroom app and give that the name Lightroom CC, and then call the desktop only application Lightroom Classic. Lightroom CC is pretty great too, but it's a little less powerful than Lightroom Classic as far as organizing and doing batch editing and cool stuff like that goes. So Lightroom Classic is one of my favorite applications. It doesn't replace Photoshop. It goes hand in hand with it, although it does help you work more efficiently and create better editing, in my opinion. So if I'm working on a project, I might not even open Photoshop until the very end. I can do 95% of my editing in just Lightroom, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. So maybe I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the chat for you again. This is our workshop. We call it an agenda. It's more of a reference site. And there is a zip file here. And I want to see, these have almost uploaded. So I'm going to go ahead and share this link with you all. I'm going to encourage you to download these files and follow along with us so that you get the firsthand experience. But if you want to just watch, that's fine as well. And these are these 5 files, and then this zip file as well. I do apologize for the separated links. That was a little bit of a surprise. Okay, so we'll talk about Lightroom, and then we'll jump into Photoshop, which I'm pretty sure everybody here has used Photoshop or seen Photoshop. Has anybody not used Photoshop before or seen it? Pretty sure. It's a verb now, right? It's become like Xerox is the word for photocopy. Kleenex is a word for tissue. Photoshop is the word for editing an image. I photoshopped this. Can you Photoshop it? It can do so much more than just what we'll show today, but we're going to have a very focused look at it. All right, so hopefully you've been able to download these files, and there's just one left. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, Lightroom is a really great application that is meant to mimic the days of film photography, where you would kind of look at your negatives on a light table and pick which ones you wanted to work on. You make your contact sheets, and then you'd go in the darkroom, get it, darkroom, Lightroom is a digital version, and you would print copies of your images, and your negative would never change, which is what we call a non-destructive process. So Lightroom is 100% non-destructive. It never changes your originals, which is an extremely valuable thing, because sometimes we all lose our concentration and make a mistake, save a black and white version over the original, and now we've lost that color version forever. So when you open Lightroom, you'll be greeted with the library, and it'll say, click import to begin. We're going to be importing a little differently than you might if you are working from a memory card. So I do want to show you what it looks like when you put a memory card in the computer while Lightroom is open. It will automatically open the import dialog for you. And this import dialog on the left-hand side is where your files are coming from, which images, which location. And in the middle is where you choose your files that you want to import. And on the right-hand side is where you're going to save them. So if I click on this folder with these images, it will display everything on my memory card, which I'm a new dad, so there's a lot of baby stuff going on right now. I'm sorry if you don't like babies, it's okay. So you would choose where you're going to copy them to your computer. But what we're doing is taking files that are already on the computer and adding them to Lightroom. So we'll click import. And you can select your source here. If you click this, you can choose your desktop or other source and find your usual navigation for Windows or Mac, depending on which one you're on. You can also navigate through these directories here. They're not as user-friendly as you might like, but what you can also do is if you've downloaded the file, make sure you double-click the zip file so that it opens those files up for you. But you can just drop the folder in there. And what I'd like to do, because I made our download a little bit interesting, is before you drop the folder in there, get those 5 extra files inside that same folder and then drag it over. If anybody needs help with that, I can demonstrate it. Basically, you'll have these in your downloads folder. So you just open up a second window, press Command N on a Mac, I think Control N on Windows, and you just drag them into your workflow files, and then you can drag the whole folder, or you can select them all and pop them in there. And now we're cooking with gas. I do apologize for that little hang up. So here we have these files. When you're importing, you can uncheck, you can double click to look at them. You can go back to the grid and select which ones you want to save. In this case, I've already selected which pictures we're working with, so we're going to import all of them. And we're going to use the add option because we're just adding them to Lightroom from where they are on the computer. You can move them if you want to choose a new location on the right-hand side, or you can copy them if they are on a flash drive or a memory card. You definitely want to copy. Otherwise, when you take your memory card out or your flash drive, Lightroom will lose your files. So let's go ahead and import here. And now we've got our first collection of images in our catalog, and you can import over and over again and build your catalog. Personally, when I am building catalogs, I tend to do them by project. If I photograph a wedding, I make a new catalog just for that. If I photograph, I do have a catalog of just my baby, so I have a catalog called Judah, it's his name. So file organization goes a long way, although Lightroom at least forces a little bit of it on you. Before we go any deeper, I can't stress enough how important it is to have your files in a location that makes sense and to not move them after you have imported, because Lightroom doesn't copy them into itself, it just points to them. So it says, I know this adorable baby lives in your desktop. So if I right click, show in Finder, it says, I know that it's in your desktop on a folder, in a folder called Lightroom PS Workflow, and it's called boyo.jpg. If any of those things change, the file gets a big question mark on it, or a little one. So if I name it, well, let's just move them into the desktop. Okay, so now I have an exclamation point. So the question mark is old news. And this file has a preview, but I won't be able to export it or copy it anywhere. This exclamation point is a big problem. It says, where'd the file go? It used to be here, but now it's not. And you can locate it, or you can just move it back. Let's go ahead and just tell it, oh, oops, I put him on the desktop. And you'll see now that exclamation point is gone. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about culling your images, because a lot of us, when we go out on a shoot, I'm guilty of this. I tend to take too many photographs, and a lot of them will look the same. And you really need to cut it down, because you don't want to edit 50 photographs if 30 of them are basically the same, although you could, because it's pretty quick. So in the library, you can double click and look at your images. We've got these very handsome sheep. You can zoom in and check your focus just by clicking on it, and you zoom back out by clicking again. To go back to a grid, you can double click, or you can use these little buttons down here. Okay, so as you go through these, my favorite way to select images I'm going to work on is by using the star system. 5 stars or no stars. I actually don't use the ones in between. So if I want to work on this picture, I'll say, I think I want this one 5 stars. And I just press 5 on the keyboard. And you can see it has 5 stars here and also underneath the thumbnail when you're in grid view. So let's pretend we love almost all of these. I just cycle through them with my arrow key and give them 5 stars. If you give something 5 stars by mistake and you actually don't want to work on it, you can press 0 to give it no star ratings. It doesn't mean you think it's a 0, it just means it doesn't have a rating. So 5 stars. And now let's actually look at these 5, because it's a sequence of very similar images. And I'm going to look at these and review them and say, okay, these are very similar. He looks a little sleepy here, so I'm not going to 5-star him. He's got a nice smile here. My wife is smiling, 5 stars. This one's nice too, 5 stars. And this is kind of sweet, maybe a little calmer moment. So imagine you're going through a ton of photographs. Your first run through, you go ahead and 5 stars ones you think that you're going to work with, and then you'll do a second pass to really eliminate. And that's where you go to your smart collection on the left-hand side, and you say, show me my 5-starred photographs. And you can see it eliminated the ones I didn't give 5 stars. And if I take a moment and say, oh, these are really similar, let's check our focus. This one's actually not as sharp, and I'm just arrowing back and forth. I'm going to give this one 0 stars. It is removed from this collection. Are there any questions at this point? Because this is the importing, selecting, and getting ready to edit process. And then Tess is going to take over in a moment to show us the develop panel. And of course, if your questions come up later, ask them whenever you like. Oh, very good question. You just click to zoom. I might have said that really quickly, but your mouse is your zoom function. You can also press Z to zoom in and out. By default, Lightroom zooms in between fit and full size. So when you're zoomed out, it's just fitting it to the screen. When you're zoomed in, it's showing you at 100% resolution. And I'll show you guys one more thing because it's driving me a little crazy. These pictures are needing to be flipped over. So I'm going to hold shift and select both of them. And right here on the bottom, I have my 2 rotation commands. I will rotate clockwise. Pretty good. And just to take note, at this point, I haven't had to actually open any files, go into Photoshop or anything. I can very quickly review really hundreds of images in one go. All right. Tess, you ready for develop mode?
Let's do it.
All right. I will stop my share.
All right, and I will start. All right, can everyone see my screen? Awesome, perfect. All right, so like Alex said, we are going to be moving into the develop panel. So earlier we were in the library, and now you'll notice we're in the second tab over, which is develop. So this is where all of the juicy editing starts. This is where I'm going to say the fun part starts. You know, Alex did a great job, but this is where all the fun is going to happen. So for this workshop, we're going to specifically focus on this very top panel. It's going to be called the basic panel. And this is where all of the basic editing is going to take place. The very first step that we're going to take is cropping. The command for that is going to be R on your keyboard. And if you go ahead and click that, it will bring up the crop tool. But also if you just click this little box right over here, kind of the universal sign for crop, it will also go ahead and bring that up as well. So like the crop tool says, you can crop it if you have an idea of what you need already. You can go ahead and crop it like this. Lightroom also has some preset crops as well. So if you have a specific dimension that you're looking for, you know, for Instagram, for Facebook, if there's something you're wanting to do, you can click that. It will create the constraints for you and you can shift it around as necessary while keeping that ratio if you're interested in that. So again, just selecting what you need. And when you're done, go ahead and at the bottom corner, click done. But also within this menu is probably one of my favorite tools. And if you notice when you hover over where it says angle, this little ruler kind of lights up, turns yellow. If you click on it and drag it over to your image, what this is going to do is it's going to really help you level out and straighten up your photos using the Adobe magic as it is. So if you notice in this image, we have a lot of lines. There's a lot of lines, and this is really helpful because what we're going to use this tool for is we're going to choose a line on our image and we're going to say, this is the line that I want to be straight. So in this case, you'll notice the address is a little askew. So I'm going to go ahead and drag my mouse over this of what it exists currently. And I'm going to say, this is what it's at. And this is the line that I want straight. So I'm going to let go and boom, it's going to go ahead and give me a straight selection. So if you go ahead and click done, you'll notice that it went ahead and straightened our image for us. So that's nice. So if you notice over here, after you move out of the crop, we're going to go into the basic panel right over here. So we'll look at our image. We're going to say, you know, it's pretty nicely exposed. It's fairly nice, but there's more we could do to it. You know, maybe we have a specific style. The very first thing that you probably want to take a look at is this eyedropper tool. This right over here is going to help you automatically set your white balance. So this is really nice. You can, of course, do this manually if you have a specific style or if you're really good at eyeballing it. But if you want to utilize the tools that Lightroom has, you can go ahead and click this eyedropper. And what you want to do is find a neutral color on your photo and tell it, this is what the neutral color is. Please white balance off of this. So obviously white is a really good example of a neutral right over here. So we're going to go ahead and click on this pretty little white petal. And you notice it kind of didn't do too much, but that was because we, you know, I think Alex took this photo, it was already fairly nicely white balanced, but suppose it wasn't, it would go ahead and adjust it for us as well. So I highly recommend doing that. So we'll move over to these individual sliders right over here. If you notice, the temperature is kind of pulled back because this is the automatic white balance that Lightroom said. This is where the sweet zone is for this photo, but you can adjust this temperature based off of your preference. So if you want it to be a little bit cooler, you're going to go ahead and drag it obviously closer to the blues, and you'll notice that it gets a lot cooler. And if you are you prefer warm tones, I'm a warm tone sort of person, you want to move it more towards the warmer tones. If you notice, more and more we're getting towards the orangey bits, and obviously if you go all the way, it's going to look a little crazy. So I always say the color temperature slider is one of my favorites, but it's also one of the most delicate. So when you're moving it, you know, be gentle with it. You can also go ahead and adjust with the numbers right over here. If you're somebody that really likes to rely on having numbers, that's also something that's super helpful. So let's say I really like it, you know, right over here. To me, this is my style. I really like it. It looks good. The next slider over is the tint. So the tint is going to go ahead and change from a green to magenta color tone. And if you notice when I move it over towards the magenta, it's going to get more magenta, green over to the green. This is helpful when you're color correcting because often some photos will come out maybe looking a little too green, right? You took a picture of a bunch of trees, there's a bunch of reflections on the water that's super green. You don't like that. To counterbalance it, you want to go in the opposite direction. So if there's too many greens in your photos, you're going to want to go over to your magentas, and vice versa. If you notice your tone is a little too pink, you can move over to the green side, and that will help counterbalance that. You have a really pretty image here, so I'm going to say that this looks really good to me. I really like it here. You know, the skin tones don't look a little too blue, but you know, it doesn't take it out. So we're going to move on to the next little slider area over here. So exposure. Exposure is the big one, right? It's the brightness. We're going to get more light into our photo or less light into our photo. For this one, we want to add a little bit of light just to give it a little bit more exposure. And exposure is another one of those very delicate sliders. So I say use this gently when you're doing your edits. If you notice, even going up a little bit right over here halfway is going to make it look very crazy. So you're going to want to probably just find what the sweet spot is to you. Editing is also a very personal thing. So there's a lot of preferences that you have. Some people prefer just to make the basic edits. You know, if you're here as an instructor in colleges, you know, oftentimes we make very basic edits because we just want to have photos that look good for a class or for a specific project you're working on. And other times, especially if you're a little bit of a creative photographer, you can add your style in. And I can show different examples of what these do. But let's say, for example, we just wanted to get a very basic edit. Looks nice, is going to be good. Want to make sure we can make everything out. So bumped up the exposure a little bit. Contrast does exactly what you think it does. It adds in more or less contrast depending on what you see. If you have something that's a little bit washed out, you can add a little bit more contrast in, and it will boost that up a little bit. Again, if you have something that's a little bit too contrasted, you can take it away, and it'll look like this. But for this one, I'm going to add some contrast in because I really like those flowers. I want to add some punch to them. I think it would be really pretty. So if you notice, we have done, you know, a very gentle amount of editing on the sliders. We haven't moved anything too crazy. But if you want to see the before and after of what you have done, a really helpful and probably the most used shortcut you will see in Lightroom is the backslash on your keyboard. And if you do backslash, it'll give you a before and after. And when I'm editing, I use this probably every 5 seconds just to see what I've done. And that's very, very helpful. So here's the before, what we just did, and the after. It's very subtle, but it adds a little bit more. It makes the photo a little bit more, you know, cleaner, nicer, intriguing. So the next little panel over here is the highlights, shadows. Highlights, if you notice right over here, the brightest portions of our photo. If you bring up the highlights, you're going to notice it's going to make the brightest parts of your photo even brighter. And if you bring them down, it's going to bring them down even further. The next photo I'm going to show will demonstrate this a lot more dramatically and what you can do. For this photo, because it's pretty nicely exposed, it's not going to matter too much. But in general, when you bring down your highlights, you're adding in more details. And when you're bringing up your highlights, you're taking away a little bit of them. So it's always a balance, right? Editing is always going to be a balance of what you need. So if I were to bring the highlights all the way down, you'll notice you can see a little bit more texture in these flowers. But if we bring them up, you'll notice it kind of goes away a little bit. So we'll say for just this purpose, I'm going to just bring them up just a little bit because I like that punchy white colors. And shadows are going to basically do the opposite. They're going to take the darkest portions of your image where you have obviously your shadows, and they're going to bring them up or down. So if I bring this up, you'll notice the shadows right over here getting brighter. And you'll notice overall the photo gets brighter, but it's going to specifically focus in the darkest corners of your photo. And again, the next one I'm going to show is going to demonstrate this far better. But if you bring it down the other way, it's going to give us more shadows, more dramatic. You know, if I brought my shadows down, you know, this photo took a very dramatic turn, right? We went from a light, flowery, happy photo, and now it's a little bit more intriguing. It's a little bit more like, what's going on at this house? So let's do a before and after and see. So you'll notice, wow, there's a lot more contrast. There's a lot more dramatic. The hand really pops out when you bring down the shadows because the bright portions right over here are going to be highlighted. Whites and blacks do some somewhat of a similar concept, but this one is going to say, take the widest part of our photos and just make them wider. So if you'll notice right over here, it does similar things. Blacks is going to say, take those black portions and make them even blacker. In different combinations, these can look really cool. I often like to bring up my shadows and then bring down my blacks, and it brings up the details, but then keeps the details that are kept even darker. So let's say we bring that down. We've got a very dramatic flower photo now. Bring up exposure just a little bit. And going back and forth, Lightroom's all about going back and forth, right? You make one adjustment here, then you got to go all the way back up here because you did something and you realize, oh, I don't really love it in the end. The next little section I'm going to focus on is down here in vibrance and saturation. So vibrance is going to go ahead and pull up all of the colors and make it more vibrant, but it's not going to affect the skin tones too much. It's going to keep those fairly, as long as you're not going crazy with it, fairly intact. So the colors that we'll probably see are going to be over here. So let's bring up the vibrance and you'll notice it's a little bit more punchy. Saturation is going to do the whole image. Saturation is another very delicate slider. You know, if you bring it up very quickly, you're going to notice, you know, it gets a little too much, right? And if you bring it down, obviously, you can take out some of that. It's always a balance. Sometimes when I bring up vibrance, I like to bring down saturation because you're bringing out some punchiness, but you want to make sure you're counterbalancing so you're not bringing too much craziness to the photo. So I'm going to pull this down just a little bit. And here's our very basically edited photo, but you can notice from the before and after how different it looks just from using the basics panel. So we have before, we have after. You know, the colors pop out a little bit more. We have a little bit more punchy contrast. We've brought everything together and it looks, in my opinion, very nice. Of course, if your style's the other way, you can make this a lot brighter, a lot happier, you know, again, just depending on what you like. So I'm going to take a quick pause and see if you have any questions just on these basic sliders. I will do this again with another photo that demonstrates a little bit better some of these concepts, because like I said, this was a very pretty color or very pretty exposed photo, you know, looking pretty good. Way to go, Alex. Check the chat. Cool, cool, cool. All right. So that looks great. I'm going to say that we really like that photo. We're going to move on to the next one. So the next photo we're going to look at right over here is this cute little puppy. Look at him, but it looks a little dark, right? It's a little hard to see him. We might really want to bring the puppy out a little bit more, right? And you'll notice in this photo, we have a lot of shadows and we have a lot of highlights, right? We have two very dramatic lighting situations. So this is a really good way to demonstrate a little bit better what those sliders do. So I'm going to go straight up to the shadows first, because the first thing I want to do is I want to see what this puppy looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the shadows up. And if you notice, oh, there's that's that cute little puppy, right? Look, it's so sweet. And we can see it. So again, you know, if I pull it all the way up, it might be a little bit too much. And when you pull shadows up, you'll notice you'll get a little bit of what we call noise in the photo. So again, finding that balance, you know, I probably don't want to pull it all the way up, but you know, right over here is a good sweet zone for me. I really like the way this looks. But over here, we've got these blaring highlights and I can't really make out what's going on in the background. When you see that situation, you're going to want to go ahead and pull down your highlights. And you'll notice that they come down and we can make out a tree. This is a pretty brightly exposed photo, so we're not going to be able to save everything, but you can kind of get an idea of, all right, it's a little less blaring, you know, we're a little less dramatic on the lighting over here. But now we've got this cute little puppy. We can see him a lot better. And now we can play around with the other sliders, you know, just like we did before to see if there's anything that we need. You might want to play around with exposure, see if that does a little bit anything. Maybe bring up the contrast, because when you bring up the shadows, sometimes that can take a little bit of contrast away. We want to add a little bit back. Maybe it's a little too warm of a photo. We want to bring it down to be a little bit cooler. You know, we don't want it too orangey. So again, if it's really warm, you go in the opposite direction to the cool tones, bring up the cool tones a little bit. And we're going to add a little bit of green in here just to counterbalance some of that pinkness. Look at that. And remember from when Alex showed you, your mouse automatically becomes the zoom, so you can zoom in, and wherever you click is where it's going to zoom into. So we're going to click and zoom in. And now that's looking better already. So let's do a before and after. So we have before, very dark, lots of shadows, and after, whoop, you can see the cute little puppy. So that's an example of what these sliders can do when you're working in a little bit more dramatic situation. It's very helpful to take a look at your photos beforehand and just get an idea of what you're working with. So for example, when I saw that photo in our examples, I was like, I know exactly what I'm going to demonstrate is going to be the highlights and shadows because we have such crazy highlights and shadows. Any questions on that? All right, well, I think I'm going to pitch it back over to Alex then for the develop. That's pretty much in the develop. Again, we can come back to any of this if you have any more questions or want to see anything else, because if you scroll down, you'll see there are so many different things that you can do with Lightroom. It's very powerful and you can get some really cool styles and effects going on. But we just wanted to show you right over here the very basics panel and how dramatic of edits you can get even with just the basics panel. So as long as there's not any more questions, I'm gonna pitch it on back over to Alex.
Thanks, Seth. Here we go. That was really great. Like she said, this develop panel is very, very capable and it goes pretty deep. But I think it can be a little overwhelming if we show you everything and then you're trying to remember what something was. So we started here. We will be having another workshop in early June, June 3rd, actually. That is a deeper dive into what these sliders do and also going further into Photoshop. So just as a reminder, Lightroom has these different panels, these modes. We're focusing on library and develop. If you want to switch over to your develop panel, you can click on it or you can press D on the keyboard and it'll show you those sliders. When I want to go back to my library, maybe I want to see them all as a grid again, I like pressing G for grid. These little keyboard shortcuts, as you internalize them, they help you work faster, which is really nice because culling can be kind of a drag sometimes. So the better you get at it, the more fun you get to have editing. So I'm going to press D again. And what I want to demonstrate for a moment is something that only Lightroom can do, because technically the editing we just saw in the basic slider, you can do all of that in Photoshop too. Now, we did already see one thing was that Tess could go very easily from editing one picture to another without actually opening them. It's very similar to like being in a file browser, which is already an advantage that Lightroom has. But one of my absolute favorite things is the ability to copy your adjustments from one image to another, the ability to auto sync your adjustments. You can select a whole row of images and apply the same adjustments to it. And you may have noticed, I noticed because I was peeking, on the left-hand side, we have our presets, and Tess had a whole collection of her own custom ones, but we also have the Lightroom built-in ones. So we'll talk about presets as well. Let me, I can't find my, oh, there it is. If there aren't any questions about the develop modes still, I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. Okay. So let's say I'm going to edit this picture, and I'm going to go through a little quickly because this is review now. I'll go ahead and crop it. I'm going to post this on Instagram, and the vertical max for Instagram is 4:5. I'll click and drag it over. I'll move it over to center them, and then I'll use that level to follow what line I want to be straight and straighten my image up. Then I can hit enter or done, and my image is cropped. If I look at this, the white balance seems a little strange. A little tip, on finding a neutral color. I mean, cement is generally neutral, but if you look at the RGB values, a neutral color should have a very similar percent of each. So 21, 20, 21, that's pretty neutral. We'll click it. And, you know, it's not always exactly what you want. In my opinion, it's a little too blue and a little too green. So I'll dial it back a little bit. And looking at this image, the highlights are a little intense. So I will pull the highlights down. And that's not too bad. That brought a little back. And then I'll pull the exposure up a teeny bit. And then I like to pull the saturation down a little bit and pull the vibrance up. Maybe we'll add a tiny bit of contrast. And by the way, if you ever don't like an edit that you did and you just want to get it back to 0, you can just double click that slider and it'll put it back to 0. I also want you to notice this history panel. Lightroom remembers everything you've done to your image ever, and you can always undo. Even if I quit Lightroom and open it back up, that history will always be there. And that's part of that really nice non-destructive process that it has. Okay, we could spend a long time with this. Well, let's go ahead and just make it black and white so that we see a black and white image. And generally black and white, we like to give it a little more contrast. So let's pull the blacks in. Now, I just spent, I don't know, a minute or two editing this picture, but I have 2 more exactly like it. If I click on the next one, I don't want to go through that whole process again, and I want to make sure I'm consistent with my editing. So there's a few ways to get the same edit on multiple images. The first way is if you're going from one you edited to one that you want to have the same, you can go over here and just say, hey, apply the previous edit. And it applies the previous edit. It also does your crop, which can be problematic if you aren't using a tripod or you have a moving subject. So you can go back into your crop overlay and fix that. Now, the other way you can do it, let's go ahead and reset this image, is you can click on your edited image. And on the left-hand side where your history is, you can copy all of your adjustments. And you can see right now, it's not really doing much of them. It's not doing my basic tone, my white balance, or anything. So what I want to do is check all and then uncheck what I don't want applied, which is usually crop and spot specific things, but I didn't do any of that. So I clicked copy, I said check all, and I unchecked crop. So I copy that, and then I can go to the next image and I can paste. And I can go to the next image and also paste. I can press Command Z as well to undo. And the undo will be specific to what you've done in Lightroom, not what you've done to that image. So if I keep pressing undo, it takes a moment to get back to the other one. But you can press Command Z as many times as you like. Do you have any questions about copying settings or just clicking previous? Because we're kind of doing 6 and half a dozen here. And the last way to do this is my favorite way. Okay, and don't be shy. At the end, we'll have time for questions too. So let's reset this again. And this final way is what's called auto sync. And this is huge if you have taken a lot of images in the same light setting with the same exposure. You can't auto sync all the photographs we have here because they have dramatically different lighting. So in fact, let's go ahead and demonstrate it. We'll click on this image, and then I'm going to hold Shift and click on a row of images. So now I have 4 images selected, and my previous button has turned into this auto sync button. And when it says auto sync, whatever I do on my current image will be applied to the other selected images. So if I click black and white here, all 4 images are converted to black and white. If I go back to color, they'll all go back to color. And let's do what we did before. We pulled the highlights down. We gave it a little extra exposure, a little less saturation, a little more vibrance. That tends to be my game. I pull saturation down and vibrance up. A little contrast, pulling the blacks down. And I don't recommend auto syncing your crop unless it was taken with a tripod, but you can always do that. And now if we cycle through these images, they have all been given the same adjustment, which doesn't always make sense. So you can reset your crop. And especially on this picture that was taken with different light, with different camera and everything, I would just reset that. Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you are your presets. And then we're going to party in Photoshop, which is also super fun. Tess is the party side of this workshop, and I'm the like, hey, wouldn't it be fun if you could do things to more than one picture guy? So somebody's got to play that role. It's fine. Okay, so let's say you've got an image and you're not really sure how you want to edit it. You're kind of new to editing and you don't have a style yet. There's all these presets here that you can apply to your images. Maybe you want black and white, and you see if I just move my mouse over it, I get a preview. Black and white landscape, which tends to be a little lower contrast. Black and white high contrast. Low contrast. Punch, which is even higher contrast than high contrast, I guess. Flat, soft. So you get all these different black and white. You even get a sepia tone and a split toned, which is it gives a blue tone to the shadows and a yellowish tone to the highlights, which can be pretty nice. We have warm and moody, and you can actually stack these. You can say, I want high contrast and detail, so it applies that. And then I want to apply the black and white landscape, and it will apply both of them on there, I believe. I might actually be wrong about that. And there are also other presets like, oh, it might be my own personal one. Well, there's vignettes. You can apply, like, this is getting kind of, I might be dating myself here, but this is getting a little Blair Witch Project looking now, like we're in the woods at night with our potato cameras. And you can apply even sharpening. Sharpening, we're not going to talk about very much, but what sharpening does is it applies contrast to the edges to make it appear sharper. You can even add grain if you want to keep pushing that lo-fi look. And I guess I have my own preset that I made down here. I'm going to go ahead and click and zoom out. That is a white border. So we're not going to go crazy with talking about making your own presets, but you can take all of your adjustments, click the plus up here, and name it a preset that you can use whenever you like, which is what I saw when I was watching Tess. So your presets are pretty nice, and you can take an image that has had presets applied to it. You can click on the next image, and you can say, hey, apply previous, and it will do those same things to it. And it might not be exactly what you want, but then you can go and change it afterwards. You can pull the shadows up, bring the highlights down, control your exposure. So that's a really fun way, I think, to get started for people that don't quite know how to edit yet or what they want to edit, because you can also see what happens in the develop panel. It's not just a magic filter that is applied, it's real adjustments that you can reference for your own learning. I think that's it for syncing and presets. Any questions there? All right. Tessa's going to do some magic. I think she's going to make sheep disappear or pull them out of a hat. I'm not exactly sure. Let's find out.
That's right. All right. And like Alex said, we're going to make some sheep disappear. So this is one of the images that we're going to use. We can pretend that I took and edited this photo myself, but to be honest, it's an Adobe stock image. So that's our shameless plug for this workshop of use Adobe stock. You can find some wonderful high quality images like this one and pretend that you edited them yourself. But suppose this is one of them. And we really love this edit. The colors look great. We think everything looks really pretty. But we're just not quite sure about these sheep, right? We're not sure if this is what we want. So one way that we can go ahead and take care of that is in Photoshop. The great thing, because this workshop is demonstrating how these two work together, these two tools will start to work together very nicely. So on your image, you're going to go ahead and right click, and you're going to select Edit In, and you're going to say Edit in Adobe Photoshop. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And this is going to ask if you want to edit a copy, edit the original, or edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. I would recommend, if you have edited this, you think, the colors are really great and you think it's really pretty, go ahead and click Edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, because this is going to pull over all of the, adjustments that you had just made. We're going to say Edit. And we're going to wait for my computer to open it up in Photoshop. Oh, that wasn't that quick. Okay. All right. That's great. Sometimes my computer can be a little complicated. So we have this wonderful photo of these sheep. And now we're in Photoshop. And we've mentioned before, Photoshop is far more powerful and does an infinite, in my opinion, amount of things that you can do. I'll try and do just a very basic demonstration of what I would do if I wanted to remove some of these sheep. So the very first thing that I would do in Photoshop is notice that I have a background layer in this panel right over here, which is our layers panel, which is great. My recommendation is to always keep what we call a clean background layer. This just means that we don't want to go ahead and make edits to this photo because we want to make sure we have something to go back to if, should all go wrong, right? So the best way is to make a copy of this background layer that we can start to edit on. And on a Mac, the command shortcut for that is Command J. I believe Control J would be on the PC version. And now we have created a layer that's an exact copy of this one, but it's not locked down. We can go ahead and make adjustments to it. We can move it around, do whatever we want with it. So this is the safe version of editing, the non-destructive way. And this is my personal preference. If you're a rebel and you just say, I just want to remove these sheep, I don't care, caution to the wind, more power to you. But this is how I would do it. So we have a copy of the background layer with all of these sheep, and we're looking at it and we think, these two sheep, they're copying this sheep. I don't really know if I like them. I really, really just want to highlight this guy, right? This is my favorite sheep. So we're going to go ahead and remove them. The way that I'm going to show how to do that is we're going to go up here to this icon panel right over here, and we're going to select the lasso tool. If you hover over a tool, Photoshop will also tell you what the shortcut is for that, which is really helpful. So in this case, it'll say the lasso tool is the L, and you can go ahead and click that. So now that we have, and we hover our mouse, we see that we have the lasso tool selected. And so we're going to go ahead and just do a selection of what we want to see disappear. So something you'll also notice is that if we take away the sheep, we also want to take away the shadow, because otherwise it's going to look like we have a ghost sheep because it's going to have a shadow, but no sheep. So something to keep in mind. So we're going to go ahead and start right over here, select this, and we're going to get this little sheep in the background too, because it'll look weird if we didn't. We're going to go ahead and get this sheep as well and his shadow. And this is the selection that we decided to make, right? So we have our selection made. And when you release your mouse, it will go ahead and close the lasso. The next thing we're going to go to is up at the very top of our panel. We're going to go to Edit. And we're going to go ahead and go all the way down to Content Aware Fill. So you'll notice right under it, we'll say Content Aware Scale. So be careful. Make sure you click Fill, because Fill is what we're working with today. We're going to head and click that. And it'll bring up this menu. So you'll have two different screens, and you'll notice right away from this screen, this is the preview of what we're doing. And you'll notice that through the magic and technology of Adobe Sensei, the computer has, or the program has recognized the selection that we have made, and it will say, I see what you have said. I'm going to sample from all of this other image, and I'm going to mush it all together, and this is what I came up with, right? So this is your preview version, and you can zoom in as well to see. You're like, all right, well, that actually did a pretty good job. You know, I really like the way that this looks. If you didn't like the way that you would look, you'll notice that this window right over here, and you probably want to make a little smaller error, it will have a minus sign in the middle of your brush. This is basically saying you can take away something, right? Minus this selection. So what Photoshop is telling you is, here's what I'm sampling to create this magic. Does this work? And sometimes it works great. Sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't look great, you can take away some of the sampling, and you'll notice that some things will start to shift around. This did a pretty good job, so I'm not going to mess with it too much, but you'll see the grass start to shift around into different sorts of ways. Again, Command Z if you're like, oops, I didn't like that. I want it to go back, and it will undo. So that looks pretty good to us. I think that looks nice. You know, the sheep are gone. It looks not too bad. We can click OK. And we're going to go back to our menu. Command D will deselect your selection. And this is what Photoshop has given us. So you'll notice right over here in our layers panel that it has created a copy of that that just has the selection that we took disappeared. So you can toggle it back on to see, because we have this layer at the back of what it originally was. I like to do this because sometimes you want to see a before and after, and you know, sometimes you're like, oh, I don't know if that actually worked. Maybe those sheep were nice after all. You can take a look and see what that looks like and delete that layer, you know, should you decide that you actually wanted those sheep after all. But for our case, and if you notice, I'm clicking the little eye next to the layer. This is basically, you know, let me see it, right? The showing version of it. So if you uncheck it, I'm not looking at it anymore. And if I check it, I'm back to seeing what we've done. So this is one way that you can do it. Something else that I noticed when I was playing around was it looks a little weird now, because now we have all these little sheeps in the background and just this one prominent sheep and then nothing on this side. So in my eyes, it looks a little unbalanced, right? The focus is a little weird. I'm like, I'm not quite sure what's going on. It almost looks like something disappeared. Something that I would do personally is I would go back to this layer copy to make sure that we're editing right over here. I would zoom into these little sheep, and I'm going to get rid of these tiny little cotton balls in the background, because, you know, I'm not quite a big fan of the way that it looks. There are so many different ways that you can do this, because they're nice and blurry little blobs in the background. It's going to be pretty easy. The way that I would do it is go to the patch tool. So in this panel right over here, you'll notice you'll have the spot healing brush, the healing brush tool, patch tool, and these are all very great ways that you can go ahead and get rid of things. I'm preferential to patch tool, and I'll go ahead and show you what that will do. So if I zoom into my little sheep that I want to vaporize, I'll go ahead and select them. I have created the selection, and now I need to move it. So I'm going to say sample from over here, and Photoshop will blend together the colors and everything and create this nice little, she's gone. And we'll do this for this little sheep over here. And I'll move it over to a similar color looking spot, because again, what it's doing is healing or blending together these colors and textures. And you want to do it in a way that, you know, makes sense and looks good for your photo. If I were to take this and sample from all the way over here, it might not look as great. So I'm going to sample from a similar place. That little sheep's gone. We're going to move over here. Do the same thing, drag it over. That sheep's gone. And those sheep are gone. So now when we zoom out, we have one sheep in this photo. All of the sheeps have disappeared. And now this photo looks better to me, because it just feels like there's a focal point. It's this one sheep that, you know, one sheep to rule them all, right? Like, this is what this sheep looks like. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how to add text to this image. So say this was a poster you were working on, maybe it's a graphic for social media. I'm going to go ahead and make sure the top layer is selected, because I'm going to add a text layer. And when you are adding layers, you always want to make sure you're knowing the order of them. I want this text layer to be on top of all the edits we just made. So I'm going to make sure the top one is selected. I'm going to go over here to our panel, and I'm going to find the little T for text. Click on the text. I'm going to have the horizontal type tool selected. I'm going to go over here. Notice that this is where my mouse has changed into a type tool. I'm going to click, and it'll give me some sample text, and I can go ahead and change it to say whatever I want. So, you know, maybe I'm going to say one sheep to rule them all, right? Maybe this is what I want it to say. And you can go ahead and change your font right up here. You can change the size of your font. So maybe I want this to be a little bit bigger. I can make sure that this is highlighted, make sure it's that, let's say 60 feels nice to us. And I'm going to make sure that the move tool, which is the very top icon right over here on our panel, is selected. And I'm going to move it to wherever I want in this image. You know, obviously up here won't look that nice. I think right over here looks good to me. This is the final product for what I've determined. And I think it looks really nice. I think it looks really great. And now we want to bring it back into Lightroom. So we've made all of those edits. We think it looks great, but we want to put it back to where we were. So the very simple thing that we have to do is just save it, which is really nice. So I'm going to hit Command S to save it. You'll notice it'll give me my little load menu. It says saved. And now I'm going to hop back over into Lightroom. And we'll notice there is my image now, right next to the other image that we had earlier. So we have the original version with all of the sheep, and now we have the version that has one sheep to rule them all.
Hey, Tess.
Yes.
We had a question about how you removed the sheep. Could we maybe try and review that?
Absolutely.
Real quick. I think they were asking what tool you used, actually.
Yeah, I think just show them the lasso and just remove that last sheep real quick.
Yeah, we can just
no more sheep.
No more sheep. All right, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go back in and I'm going to make sure that I'm on a layer that has the sheep in it, because if I'm on this layer, there's nothing here. So that won't be great. I'm going back to this layer, going up to the panels right over here where I'm going to click the lasso tool. So L if you're doing shortcuts, but we're going to go back to lasso tool, and I'm going to lasso this sheep. So I'm going to do a, you know, rough little selection around this sheep, which is very difficult with this mouse. I like to work. I have one of those pads for editing with the pen. I'm a little pretentious like that, but so we'll select our little sheep. We're going to go up to the top panel right over here. We're going to click edit, and we're going to scroll all the way down to content aware fill. We'll click that. And that sheep sure did disappear. So again, this is the panel that we were in earlier that's giving us a preview of what we are seeing. It's sampling from all of this. And again, if this didn't look good to us, we could take away some of the sample areas to make sure that those aren't being incorporated. And it'll shift it around a little bit. But, you know, for demonstration's sake, let's say that that looks really good. We really like it. We're going to say, okay. And it's going to bring us back here. We're going to deselect by Command D and zoom out, and there's no more sheep. In fact, there is not one sheep to rule them all. They're all gone. Any questions on that?
Just as a reminder, you can Command Z and bring your sheep back too. Maybe
bring your sheep back.
A couple Command Zs to show them.
Yes.
Absolute favorite keyboard shortcut.
The undo button is your best friend. Yes. So, you know, we can say, oops, actually, I really like that sheep. I'm going to bring them back. And then you'll notice it deleted, or not deleted, but it undid what we just did. And that layer is gone. We now have a sheep again. We still have one sheep to rule them all. So we have decided that that was good. And again, you could just hit save and go back in here, and it'll pop back into Lightroom, which is really exciting. Order has been restored. And yes, Brian mentioned the patch tool was what I used for the little sheep in the background. You could use the spot healing brush tool, the healing brush tool. A lot of this just depends on the situation and what you're comfortable with. I would say play around with a bunch of different stuff and just see what you like, because that really just depends on what you use. I personally love the patch tool because I can get a better, I feel I have more control over the area, and that's what I wanted in this one. But again, your preference. Any questions on that? Are these tools only good for sheep? No, in fact, you could remove any animal or any item that you really like. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate one more thing in Photoshop, and then I'm going to throw it back over to Alex. For time's sake, I'm going to try and do it a little bit quick. But fortunately, we only have one little thing that I wanted to demonstrate, and that was what adjustment layers are.
And Tess, can you answer this other question? Is there a reason we edit in Lightroom and then go to Photoshop, or can you reverse the order?
Can you reverse? I mean, sure, you could reverse the, I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? Your workflow is your workflow. But the way that I would say starting in Lightroom has benefits is because you can do color adjustments on the raw file and then come back into Photoshop to do any touch-ups. That's a very common, I would say, photography workshop. You could reverse the order. If you shoot in RAW, Photoshop has the camera raw window that you can do that looks almost identical to this as well. I would say the reason you start in Lightroom is because of what Alex demonstrated earlier, which is culling, organizing, and making sure things are in a particular way to set yourself up for success. Whereas if you were to reverse the order in Photoshop, because you can only open one photo at a time, it might be a little bit harder to do this in mass. If you have one photo that you're just working on, I would say it probably doesn't matter too much and you just want to add it into a collection later, feel free to do that. But I think the benefit of starting in Lightroom is for that organization and for editing, like we said, multiple photos all at once. And let's see, did you answer the question? Do all the layers need to be merged? No, they do not. They do not need to be merged. You can, again, if that's part of your workflow, you can, but you do not need to. In order to save, it will just take the version that you have and pop it over here. And I'm going to just go ahead and demonstrate this one last thing really quickly. So you'll notice on this photo, we have a beautifully exposed sunset sky, but it's a little dark here at the bottom. You could do this in Lightroom as well, but I prefer to do this in Photoshop. So I'm going to very quickly demonstrate an adjustment layer. So we'll do the same process again, right click, edit in, and we're going to choose Adobe Photoshop. And there we go. For this purpose as well, I don't necessarily need to create a copy of this one because what I'm going to add is an adjustment layer. So it will be automatically non-destructive, but again, do your process. So we'll start off with this image right over here. We'll take a look at this beautifully exposed sky. We aren't crazy about this area right over here. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer. So in my window, I happen to have this up right over here where it says adjustments. And if you hover over them, it'll tell you which one to choose. But where it's always located right here at the bottom panel is this little half circle that's half filled in. And if you click on that, it will give you an option of a whole bunch of adjustment layers. And we could do 10 workshops alone on how to use adjustment layers. There's so much you can do with it. For just this workshop, I'm going to say I just want to brighten up the bottom portion of this photo. So I'm going to do exposure. And I'm going to pull up the exposure until I'm happy. And if you notice, I'm like, oh, there's some trees. We see some trees. But now the sky looks awful, right? Like we brought up this exposure and oh God, what have I done, right? This is kind of the point where you freak out a little bit, but you love the way that this bottom part looks. You can do a mask, and to create that, a very, very easy version of this is to just Command I, invert it, and you'll notice right over here, it goes back to normal, but we've got this mask created right over here. So you want to make sure in this icon panel right over here that the white little card is selected right over here and the black one is right here. And you're going to hit the Command shortcut B for brush and create a brush. And now you can paint on the adjustment layer in just the areas that you want. So, you know, we want to get it on the trees. And maybe we don't want this rock to be any more, you know, brightened up because it's already at a nice exposure. So I'm going to avoid that. The reason I like doing this on a brush is for that reason as well. You have a little bit more control. And, you know, you can see right over here, the areas that you are brushing on have been selected. And so you can see exactly what you've done. So now you can see it before, you know, super dark, can't see any trees. We brought the trees back and, you know, maybe we think that looks really nice. A little tip that I like to do, because sometimes, you know, it can look a little fake if you're painting, you know, we don't want this to look like Microsoft Paint. One really great way to help blend that a little bit is to notice right over here in the layers panel. If you have the layer selected, it'll say fill. This is the opacity of what you have just done. And I sometimes like to bring the opacity down just a little bit, like say 85, and that will help just smoothen things together, blend it a little bit nicer, make it look a little less harsh. Something else you want to make sure when you're brushing is the type of brush you're using. I'm using the soft round right over here. If I were to do a hard round, you might be able to see the lines of the brush, and that just looks icky, right? The soft round helps for blending, so you don't see these harsh lines in that as well. So this is what I would do. This is the final image to me. I think it looks really pretty. I've just brightened up the shadows a little bit, brushed it on in specific areas, but I missed this rock because I didn't want that rock to look too crazy because the light is hitting on it really nicely. Now I'm going to hit save again. It'll save. And if we hop back over into Lightroom, well, my computer wants to load the new version that we have just edited in. And yes, it can do the opposite, work to darken parts of the image as well. So in that case, you would just either use a tone curve or, you know, your levels or something, and you would just, you know, pretty much do the opposite version, right? So if I wanted to do, I wanted to darken something in that image, I could do the exact same thing, invert it, Command I, the brush, and I could, you know, darken certain parts of the image back if I wanted to, if that was what I was interested in. Any questions on that? All right, well, if there's no questions on that, I'm going to throw it back to Alex because I know he had one more thing to show and we wanted to leave lots of time for questions. So I don't want to belabor the point, but again, any questions at the end of this, I'm happy to answer about that.
Thanks, Tess. That was awesome. Yeah, those are really great questions. And, you know, the whole idea here is that Photoshop is kind of the second to last step when you're doing things that you just can't do in Lightroom. And there are things there's a lot of overlap, and those adjustment layers can do a lot of things that Lightroom can do too. So you can take the saturation down of a specific part. You can make a specific part black and white. You know, you can target any part with any adjustment. And that's why we're doing an additional workshop that goes even deeper into these things, because it can be a pretty deep dive. Okay, so we have edited in Photoshop and then we have saved. And I do like to point out that when you save an image that you sent from Lightroom to Photoshop, it shoots it back into Lightroom as an additional copy. If I go and right click and show in Finder, you'll see that, well, mine is set to save them as PSDs, but I think by default it's set to TIFF, which is fine. They're just bigger files. So you can see these here. And another interesting thing to note is that these images that we've edited, like this tree, if I go look at the original in my Finder, in my file navigator, which I think is called Mount Lemon, if I look at this, it is actually completely unchanged, because Lightroom stores all the editing, all the adjustments in itself. It uses these little sidecar files that aren't that interesting to know about. But I don't have this finished version available yet to share with friends, to post online, or to send to be printed or anything like that. So it's really important to know this final step, which is exporting. And if you remember, we started this whole process by importing. We said, let's import files. So Lightroom has them. And now we're going to export them so that we have finished flattened images, which is why we were saying you don't really need to flatten your layers. It's actually better if you don't, because that's that whole idea of a non-destructive process where you can always go back and make changes. If you flatten your layers, you've flattened your layers, and you no longer have the sheep data, if you will. Okay, so you can export from any panel because it's just a right click, but some people like to do it from the library mode. So let's go ahead and do that. And what I'm going to do is export these pictures, the balanced out sunset, my scary tree, and my one sheep. I was lazy, I didn't type everything out, but I followed along. So you can see, I'm not sure if I said this, I held Command or Control, and I clicked on individual images. And you can tell that they're selected because they have a highlight around them. So if I hold Command and click again, I can deselect. You can also press Command A if you want to select everything, and click on an empty part to deselect. So I'm going to hold Command, select my edited images. And what I'm going to do now is click Export here in the bottom left. You can also right click, Export. And you can actually see, just like editing has presets, export has presets too. And I have two that I use called Full, which saves a full-size JPEG in the same folder, and Web, which saves a lower resolution image for the internet. But let's just do it the first way. We'll click Export. And think of export as your save as, if you're used to like Microsoft and even Photoshop. You're creating a final copy, but you're not changing the original. So this export screen can be a little intimidating at first, but the first part is, where do you want to save these files? Where do you want to export them? You can go to a specific folder and choose. This is probably the most common relatable process, and you can go to your desktop, and or probably don't save to your desktop if you're actually being organized. You probably save to your pictures folder. That's just what I would do. But you can also say, oh, go in the same folder as the original, which is my preferred way of doing it, because your originals will then have a folder next to them called edits or finished or whatever you like. And that's what you can do, is say put in a subfolder and name it edits. It's a pretty good name for a folder. Super good edits is maybe an even better name. And then as you go through, you can tell it to rename it. We're not going to. There's no video. These file settings is the first part you might want to keep an eye on. By default, it's set to 60 for quality, which is really not that big a deal, but I like 85 personally. Most of it is not really noticeable to the human eye, but when you do this, it compresses your file and it throws away pixel information, like color information. You can resize. So this is extremely useful. If you've ever had to resize an image one by one in Photoshop, it can get tedious. Maybe you know how to make an action or something like that. But here you can say, oh, these are all going online, and I want the long edge, the biggest pixel dimension, to be only 1,000 pixels. You shouldn't have to choose don't enlarge because you're working with photos that you took, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to leave that checked. And then the resolution, web resolution has traditionally been, well, let's call it for screens, has traditionally been 72, but nowadays phone screens, actually have a higher pixel density, which is just like you stick your face in there. And if you could actually count how many pixels were in a square inch, that's what that number means. It's gone up because with retina displays, high density displays, I'm not sure what else they call them. So I go with 96 for screen resolution. If you intend to print, you should do 240, 300, whatever you like. But these are going to be pictures I just put online. And you don't want to throw full resolution images online for more than one reason. The first reason is you don't want to give your stuff away. If you have the full res file out there, somebody can download it and do what they like with it, and have their own high quality results from that. And number two, you want the user experience to be enjoyable. So if they visit a website where you put your images and they're all full resolution, it's going to load 10 times slower. You can include metadata. We're not going to dive into that, but you can put like copyright info and things like that. And then you just click export. So with this one click, it's going to save 6 pictures for me. So we'll click export. If you see in the top left, export 6 files. And it has saved all 6 of them. And remember I said, put them in the same folder as the original. So if I right click on any of these and say show in Finder, there's a folder called Super Good Edits. And inside that folder are those 6 images I had selected, where the long edge is 1,000 pixels. Yes, and that's really good. Yeah, if you upload too big a file, the social media site will compress it for you and do a bad job, which is why actually most pictures look terrible on Facebook, because they compress them even further every time. It's kind of sad. But what you can notice is these files, they're not even half a megabyte. This is the biggest one, and the originals were all 13. The PSDs were even bigger. So you want small files. And the final thing I want to leave you all with are 3 things. Let's say 3 things. Adobe has really wonderful tutorials as well. I know it's not the same as having a person that can answer questions, but under the help menu, you can say, show me the classic tutorial in Lightroom, and it will take you to a web page dedicated to learning Lightroom or reviewing. Photoshop has even better tutorials where you can go help, and you can do hands-on tutorials that are actually built into the program, which are really pretty cool. And the final thing, and we'll have only 5 minutes for questions, I'm sorry about that, is we have more workshops all summer. So I'm going to pop this in the chat, and then the rest of the time will be for any questions. We'll hang out if you have more questions than 5 minutes take. I'm not going anywhere. But thank you so much for being here. I hope this was informative and exciting, because we really love these tools, and they really help make editing a more enjoyable process once you learn them. Oh, really wonderful question, Renee. Yes, that's what I should have mentioned. Our reference site, which I'll just put in the chat one more time. We will be putting this video, this exact workshop, will be on this exact website. It'll be just right above the agenda once we get it edited and popped up there. And all of our workshops will be like this. There will be asynchronous references that you can use whenever you like. Yes, and thank you so much.